Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes and see if we get any more people to join us before we start. So here's a fun little question to put into the chat box. If you would put your name and where you teach, and since we're kind of in the giving season, I'm thinking about your favorite game as a child. What was your favorite game that you played? I did this with my other group last week, and I like Clue. I always liked Clue and Yahtzee. So the strategy games. So if you would put your name, where you teach, and maybe your favorite game to play now or as a child in the chat box. I'm Brenda Beamer Chapman. I'm the Director of Social Studies and Personal Financial Literacy at the State Department of Education. And we're going to give it just a couple minutes and see if anyone else joins us. But this will be recorded, and so we'll have it if you want to view it later or other people to view. Oh, kick the can. Do you guys have those little bop it things where you jump, you put it on your ankle and you jumped over it? Those are fun.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to introduce Becca Castleberry, and then I'm going to keep a watch kind of to let people in, but Becca's with OKAGE and she's going to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. My name is Becca Castleberry, and I'm the director of the Oklahoma Alliance for Geographic Education. Today, we have Dr. Mark Shafer, who's joining us, who serves as Associate State Climatologist for the Oklahoma Climatological Survey, and is also an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sustainability here at the University of Oklahoma. Mark is going to be talking about climate change and disaster preparedness. Then his presentation will be followed up with a lesson plan by Heather Braucher, who is also joining us today. Please feel free to drop a question in the chat box if you think of something while Mark or Heather are speaking. And if you want to stick around for a few minutes after the session, I'll go over the information about the PD certificates, along with some of OKAGE's upcoming opportunities, and we'll also do a really quick door prize drawing. Thank you so much for Brenda for hosting this opportunity, and to Mark and Heather for being with us today. And Mark, I will turn it over to you as soon as you're ready. And I will share my screen with your presentation. Give me just a second.
I'm ready.
Awesome. There we go.
Okay, well, good morning, or morning. It tells you what kind of day it is. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all doing well, and hope things are going well with your schools. I know that it's been an insane year, and hopefully we'll be getting up to break here and we can get a little bit of normalcy for everybody and a little bit of rest, especially for everybody. So best of luck to all of you. I'm going to be talking today a little bit about climate change and disasters. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, we'll start out with disasters. So next slide. So starting out with what is a disaster? We start with natural hazards because there's natural hazards and man-made hazards. So natural hazard is a natural process that's a potential threat to life and harm. So those are things that could cause damage. They don't necessarily happen. They may happen frequently. They may not happen at all. For example, a meteorite hitting the earth is a natural hazard. It's very, very unlikely to happen, or at least anything that could cause that kind of destruction, but it is still a hazard because it's a potential threat. So what we usually focus on whenever we talk about disasters are threats from weather or earth processes. So weather is the bulk of the disasters that we have and the hazards that are realized that we have. Severe storms, tornadoes, floods, drought, wildfires, heat waves, winter storms. Those are all here in Oklahoma. And actually hurricanes, you notice that on the list and go, why is that in Oklahoma? We've actually had hurricanes or tropical storms that have tracked across Texas and maintained tropical storm intensity all the way into Oklahoma. We had famous Hurricane Aaron in 2000, or Tropical Storm Aaron in 2007, which actually had weakened and then spun up again over Oklahoma because we had so much rain that year. It just thought it was back over the ocean, and Oklahoma's so flat. So it just said, oh, back over the ocean, I'll get strong again. And then Tropical Storm Bill in 2015 stayed together all the way across East Texas up in Oklahoma, Southeast Oklahoma. So hurricanes can affect us as well. That's the bulk of the kinds of threats that we experience. There are also other earth processes, physical processes like earthquakes, volcanoes. We don't have volcanoes here in Oklahoma. Landslide subsidence are also kinds of things. And the link to all this is that climate affects the frequency and severity of these weather-related hazards. That's things like sea level rise affecting various coastal impacts. It also affects frequency of droughts and wildfires and heat waves, and it can affect the intensity of hurricanes as well. So next slide. So a few definitions to start out with. The hazard, as I mentioned, a potential threat to human life and property. There can be man-made or human-made hazards as well, things like chemical explosions or train derailments, terrorism, just in infrastructure failure, bridge collapses. Those are human-made processes. I tend to focus on the natural side of things because that there is, of course, weather impacts on the human side of things, but the climate aspects are really on the natural side. A disaster is when those threats are realized. So it occurs over a very specific location over a limited time span, and it exceeds the capacity of the local jurisdiction to respond. So the ice storm that we had earlier this year in October, end of October, was a case of a disaster because it happened over a few days in a particular area of Oklahoma, and we needed external response to help us. Then you get to these really big events, and those are called catastrophes. There's really no hard and fast line. Obviously, if something happens to you, you may think it's a catastrophe, if it very personal kind of thing. But as far as like the literature, what people look at, generally catastrophes are these things that the impacts will last for years. So like a Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Harvey that cause tremendous dislocation, disruption, damage, and often in international standpoints require international aid to recover. Those would be considered catastrophes. Okay, so next slide. So we don't really experience catastrophes in the US too much. We've had a few, but the disasters are common. Every area of the country gets disasters. There are a few places that have had zero. They've somehow gotten out of this. Now this only goes through 2009. So there may have been some spots filled in since then, but basically there are a lot of places that get hit with hazards. You notice Oklahoma is very red on this. There's a lot of this by county across Southwest Oklahoma to Northeast Oklahoma, basically the I-44 corridor, a lot of ice storms, a lot of tornadoes, flood events, very common in that area. And then North Dakota is kind of unique because when they designed the rivers there, they flow northward. So in the wintertime, when the snow melts, everything's still frozen in Canada. So there's ice jams that back it up, and North Dakota gets a lot of flooding in the springtime. And then other areas, California, a lot of wildfires, especially, and other storms. You can see the hurricanes along the Gulf Coast and so forth. So disasters can occur anywhere. They're going to take different types based on the local geography of what kind of hazards affect them. The next slide. They are also incredibly expensive. These are billion-dollar disasters for 2020 so far. So these are just individual events that have caused $1 billion or more in total losses, and that includes insured and uninsured losses. You can see storms in the Midwest, the derecho this last summer in Iowa, trekked over to Chicago, tornado outbreak in the Ohio Valley. You can see 3 different hurricanes, drought in the West, wildfires. All of these different kinds of events have happened in the US just this year. And we've seen the same kind of pattern year after year with dozen or more billion-dollar events each of the last several years. So they're incredibly expensive. Next slide. And disasters have increased over time. The number of, these are FEMA declared or presidential declared through FEMA. Disasters used to have about 20 or so a year when the disaster process started, declaration process started out in the 1950s and 60s. It quickly rose to actually a peak of almost 100 in 2011. It's come down a little bit since then, but many more declared disasters recently than previously. And so one of the primary drivers of this, two of the primary drivers are population density and wealth. Population density because more people are moving to coastal areas, and coastal areas are going to be susceptible to hurricanes, to floods, coastal storms, and those kinds of things. They often would happen in an area that was sparsely inhabited, so it wouldn't really rise to the level of a disaster declaration. Now there's a lot more property in the way, so there's a lot more people to be affected. And then people have more stuff in their homes. Our parents growing up didn't have a lot of the electronics that we have now, and some of the very expensive toys that we kind of accumulate. So the likelihood of reaching the thresholds to get that disaster aid has increased just because of the number of people in the way and the amount of stuff that they have. Next slide. So hazards are linked to each other. One event can set off other events. So when a hurricane comes, you can get inland flooding, and that's a very common thing. We saw that in Harvey. Harvey actually came ashore near Rockport, Texas, down closer to Corpus Christi. Very devastating as far as the winds and things right around Rockport, but it stalled there, and the onshore flow for several days brought wave after wave of rain into the Houston area and to Beaumont, Port Arthur area, bringing over 60 inches of rainfall from one event. And that kind of flooding can happen far away from where the center of the hurricane is. And it also pushes water up against the coastline so that water can't drain out of rivers and stormwater management systems very effectively. So it backs up, and that causes more flooding as well. Other things that happen is we change the landscape. That can affect the magnitude of events. You can still have a similar event that may not have risen to a disaster level at some point in the past. Well, now because you've put a parking lot in somewhere, there's more runoff, and that runoff goes into Small Creek, and that's going to cause more flooding. You clear a hillside, that hillside doesn't have the roots of trees and grasses in there anymore to really hold the soil together in place. So when you get rain on it, it turns to mud and basically slides down. So those kinds of things, the way we affect our environment, can cause events to have bigger impacts, even if the events themselves don't change. So it's not always about the climate is changing, things are getting more severe. It can be things that we're doing in our environment that make impacts more severe. And then there's also cascading failures. When we have the ice storm is a great example where we had the damage to trees, but then it took out power systems. And then that power system leads to other things. It can lead to healthcare issues if you need power to run medical devices. It can lead to hypothermia if you don't have heat. It can lead to actually carbon monoxide poisoning from running generators. Those would be cascading failures where one thing leads to others. They're linked. Next page. So now we have all this going on, but we also have it going on in the context of climate change. Climate we've learned, is not stationary. There's always the year-to-year variability, but now there's a longer-term trend that we've been able to pick up. So next slide. Climate change does not create disasters themselves. Disasters have always occurred. They've been long before humans were around, before we started altering our environment, but we've made things worse. Humans are a factor in that. The climate changes kind of stacks the deck. So some conditions become more favorable for significant events that didn't used to happen that way. And it doesn't take a lot to set this chain in motion. Small shifts in temperatures can create enormous effects. A big thing is the atmosphere, as it warms up, can hold more moisture. So as you have more moisture in the atmosphere, you can produce more rainfall. And that moisture also, as it's converted from vapor into liquid raindrops, it releases that heat within the storm. That latent heat gets released, and that drives stronger updrafts and creates stronger storms. So just the availability of the moisture in the atmosphere, because it's warmer, creates stronger storms. That's why we have stronger thunderstorms in the summer than in the winter, because of that ability for the atmosphere to hold that moisture. Creates the conditions that the storms need to be strong. And as we ratchet up that temperature a little bit, it goes up very quickly. It also has to get that moisture from somewhere, so it pulls it out of the soil. That creates more intense droughts. And then as you have drier soils combined with higher temperatures, you also get more intense wildfires. Next slide. So this is how the process works. Climate change works, is driven by what called the greenhouse effect. I'm sure everybody's heard that term before. It's basically that every chemical composition, every compound has a kind of molecular fingerprint in regards to radiation. With carbon dioxide, it's very transparent to infrared invisible radiation, which is primarily what is coming from the sun, but it absorbs a lot in the infrared. So when the energy from the sun hits the earth and is absorbed, as it's released then again by the earth, it's released in a longer wavelength because the earth's surface is cooler than the sun, so it releases in longer wavelengths, and that's mostly in the infrared. Well, carbon dioxide loves the infrared, so as that infrared starts going back out into space, carbon dioxide says, hey, wait a minute, it grabs it, holds it, sends some of it back down to earth, and that creates an excess buildup of heat within the earth's atmosphere. So that's why they call it greenhouse effect, is because kind of lets the heat in, the energy in, but doesn't let it out. Now, some of it is going to get out, but so it's not just entirely build up, but a little bit of carbon dioxide can change that balance quite a bit. Now, if we didn't have any carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, does anyone know what the Earth's average temperature would be? If anyone wants to try taking a guess, and put that in the chat, and we'll revisit that in a minute. So see where we are. So if you can go to the next slide, we'll be doing this. So small changes, as I said, small changes to carbon dioxide cause changes in temperature. So when we go above the natural level of the outgoing radiation, it traps more heat. Most of that is actually stored in oceans. 93% of the extra energy we get trapped from carbon dioxide is going into the ocean. So just a very little bit is actually going into the atmosphere. But some of it gets in there, and we've noticed once the atmosphere warms up, it can accelerate other things. It melts snow faster. So up in northern areas, as well as Antarctica to some extent, but especially up across northern Canada, Siberia, the Arctic Ocean, in Greenland, there's a lot faster melting of snow cover. It's also melting of permafrost, the frozen grounds there that have a lot of stored methane in it. Methane is another greenhouse gas, so it's even accelerates releasing even more. So the more carbon dioxide emitted, the faster temperatures will rise. And the chart on the right shows, or the left shows, the kind of observations, models, and the observations are in the green, and the models are, or the model historical part is in the black. So they've done a good job matching those up. So looking ahead over the next 100 years, there's two different lines there. The blue line is if we greatly reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we're emitting to the atmosphere, we'll still rise a couple of degrees, but then we'll level off. If we continue what they call business as usual, we're going to be on the red line, and the temperatures in the earth will warm up to 8 or 9 degrees. And then the shading there shows the uncertainty, because the models aren't going to be perfect. It could be a little less, could be a little bit more, but the main point is if we don't do something about it, we're going to add a whole lot more heat into the atmosphere. Next slide. So humans have been around for about 315,000 years. So about the 1/3 of the chart on to the right there, this goes back 800,000 years. And during that time, you see carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere about 100 to 280 parts per million. That's not a lot. The atmosphere is primarily nitrogen and oxygen, 79% nitrogen, 20% oxygen. And then argon makes up a little less than 1%. Carbon dioxide is only 0.04% of the Earth's atmosphere. So there's not a lot in there, but a little bit goes a long way. And when the carbon dioxide levels have been lower, we've been in ice ages. When it's been higher, we've had less ice on the Earth. So right until about the late 1800s, we started the Industrial Revolution, started really increasing the carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. Up until that level, we were right in that range of 180 to 280. We were coming out of an ice age that ended about 12,000 years ago. The Earth's temperature is about 7 degrees warmer than it was then. So we were kind of going towards the peak of that natural cycle, but then we've really gone off this edge, and it's really having some impacts. The stability over that time, though, because the climate hasn't varied that much, it's affected what we grow and where we grow it. So it's affected our development of agriculture. It's affected where we place cities, how they operate. Our whole patterns of civilization really developed around places, the fertile areas of the Middle East along the Tigris and Euphrates early on, and then expansion out in coastal areas as spread around the world. All of that is kind of been in the sweet spot of carbon dioxide. The answer to that question I posed before about what would be the temperature of the Earth if we didn't have any carbon dioxide would be about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So the Earth's actual average temperature is about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So we need carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Otherwise, we'd be a ball of ice. So we need some. Carbon dioxide is good for life on Earth, but too much of it, it's just like we need water to live, but if we have too much water, we drown. So it's trying to find that right balance. Next slide. I just put this in here for reference if you want to look at it later. This is a great video. It's about 11 minutes long, and it goes. He goes through this climate history, going back millions of years, billions of years to what's affected kind of the Earth's climate. It's very fun. I think your kids and your classes would love it. So you might want to check out that link later. So I just put that in there. Next slide. So why does a little bit of carbon dioxide matter? Well, a few degrees increase in average temperature is going to accelerate evapotranspiration. It's going to pull more of that moisture up out of the ground. And through plants, the transpiration aspect is going to get it into the atmosphere. Once in the atmosphere, it can create stronger storms, and it creates more floods. So we're actually amplifying the hydrologic extremes. We're going between floods and droughts more frequently. When it's not raining, that rate of evapotranspiration is causing more droughts. And then when it comes down in bigger buckets, essentially. And then also warmer sea surface temperatures fuel hurricanes. So we've seen explosive growth of hurricanes. It used to be very rare for this kind of rapid intensification, but now we're seeing that several times a year. I think we've had 3 hurricanes this year that underwent this rapid intensification in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's very, very rare. Hurricane Harvey did that in 2017, Hurricane Michael in 2018 that hit the Florida Panhandle. These kinds of things are becoming more common. The other thing about carbon dioxide is it sticks around a long time. It stays in the atmosphere about 100 years. So what we emit today is going to stay around for another century, and that'll gradually increase Earth's temperature. So the choices we make now are going to affect how severe that impact is over the next 100 years and even longer. Next slide. And this illustrates how if you increase the temperature a little bit, so it's the black line is kind of the previous climate profile of temperature where you have cold extremes and hot extremes. If you shift that, increase the average a couple of degrees, what you're doing is you're increasing the number of events on the hot tail and fewer events on the cold tail. Now, I don't like cold weather. I actually grew up in Chicago, came to Oklahoma, said, these winters here aren't so bad. I think I'm going to stick around. So, less cold weather, I'm okay with that. But the trade-off of that is to get more hot weather. And that has huge impacts as well. Next slide. Biggest thing is more intense heat waves. So we're anticipating that will increase the frequency, intensity, and duration of these heat events. And that has a huge impact on public health, but also the natural environment, the ecosystems, the habitats for animals. It affects agriculture. It affects energy production. We need more cooling So we ramp up our abilities, and sometimes we can't keep up. So air conditioning systems go out, for example. Next slide. And it has human impacts. As we increase the risk, those temperature extremes, we increase the risk of illness and death, especially in very vulnerable populations. We also increase that risk in urban areas. The heat island effect is caused because there's a lot of concrete and steel there, which is very good at absorbing solar energy on during the day. And then it radiates that energy back out at night. So because of the makeup of it, that concrete and steel, it usually raises the temperature under certain conditions 5 or 7 degrees, sometimes even more than that, over what the environment around it is. So all of a sudden, instead of having a 95-degree day, you're having a 102-degree day. And that changes. We've documented that process in Oklahoma City. Any major city is going to have those kinds of heat island effects. And we also see when you get to those higher thresholds, you see an increase in hospital admissions, medical services calls, cardiovascular and respiratory complications from that. Next slide. And that relates to more mortality. So this is modeling with that temperature increase what we expect changes in mortality due to the extremely hot and cold days, fewer cold days, more hot days by the end of the century. These are the two scenarios. So that lower scenario on the left is where we reduce emissions considerably. The one on the right is where we do our business as usual. And we see obviously higher temperatures in the business as usual scenario, more heat waves, more mortality. So we're adding anywhere about 3,900 to 9,300 deaths estimated per year in the US under these scenarios. That may not seem like a lot, especially in the numbers we're talking about with COVID today. It just, that seems like nothing. But if you put this in the context of the average number of deaths per year related to heat in the US over about the last 20 years has been about 700. So we are going 10 times more than that potentially per year under this climate change scenario. So that's one cause of great concern. Next slide. And then this is the rainfall part of it. The chart on the right shows the saturation vapor pressure in the atmosphere, how much water vapor can be held by the atmosphere. So as the temperature goes up, that line goes up exponentially. So a little bit of a shift in temperature, we start really increasing the amount of water vapor that becomes fuel for storms, increases rainfall intensity. The chart on the left shows the number of these kind of heavy rainfall events has been increasing, especially over the last few decades. Next slide. And that leads to more flooding and hurricanes. As I mentioned, the rainfall rates come down. It overwhelms urban systems, stormwater systems, and then hurricanes themselves becoming stronger in coastal areas. There's pictures from Hurricane Harvey from the rainfall that they got from that. Next slide. And then the flip side of it was drought. That water comes out of the ground into the atmosphere. It's pulled out. So we get into drought a lot more quickly. And as we do, there's a lot of things that need that water. Humans, obviously, we need it for drinking, but also agriculture, energy production, ecology, all need that water. And as it goes away, you increase competition for that. So you create more inequalities. Areas that can afford to purchase water rights or to access or to build a longer pipeline to get to the lake that they need, they get the water for their communities, while other communities that don't have the economic resources to do that, or sometimes political clout to do that, can get left out. So that's kind of another concern that the impacts of climate change create or make inequities even more pronounced from these natural hazard events. Next slide. And that's just kind of showing more of the same thing, the increased frequency of drought in the West, Next slide. And then that also creates more wildfires. We've seen that. These charts actually only go up to about 2012, I think. And you actually see a slight decrease in Mediterranean California. Well, if we turn that around, added the last 8 years on that, you see a huge increase in California with the number of wildfires. But most places around the country, around the West, are all showing increases in wildfire rates. And also the higher temperatures allow diseases and insects like the pine borer beetle that has taken over much of the Western US, and it's destroyed a lot of areas of forest land. Well, you now have a bunch of dead trees, which contribute to those wildfires as well. And they can survive in the winter because winters are a lot warmer. Next slide. And a couple of other last effects that I'll mention is sea level rise. This shows projections for land loss in Louisiana related to basically a little less than a foot of sea level rise versus almost 3 feet of sea level rise. The bad news is that since this was produced here, the projections, latest projections are showing 3 feet by the end of the century, may be a kind of conservative estimate. And there's some estimates saying probably maybe more like 7 feet of sea level rise is more likely by the end of the century. Some projected higher than that, but it's probably not likely. And it's related to both as water temperatures warm in the ocean, thermal expansion, the molecules try to get farther apart, so you get thermal expansion. That's about half of the sea level rise. The other half is melting ice in Greenland primarily, but also Antarctica is looking a little less stable than we anticipated. So the big areas that were on land. So obviously any coastal areas, there's a lot of infrastructure along the coast, and that's at jeopardy as well there. Freshwater supplies, you get salt water pushing further into aquifers and polluting aquifers. Miami has a huge problem with this. Miami aquifers may become unusable by the end of the century. So next slide. And there's an example also in Miami of coastal flooding just from high tides. There wasn't even raining at the time. It was just water pushing in from the ocean because of a high tide event. This picture is several blocks from the ocean, and that's showing kind of, we expect to really start seeing the impacts of sea level rise in about 20 years or so. You'll start seeing that those curves take off, that rate really increase. We have seen an increase in the rate over the last couple of decades, but the impacts will really start showing up probably about 20, 30 years from now. Next slide. And lastly, sea ice, or not, I guess not quite lastly, sea ice and glaciers. This is at looking at the North Pole, 1984 versus 2016, much less sea ice out there in the summertime. And the glaciers retreating, same location. I think this is in Europe, showing a glacier that has really retreated all the way back up into the mountains. Next slide. It also melts permafrost, as I mentioned. And when you do that, the capacity of the land underneath, it becomes kind of liquid. So it can't hold structures anymore. You get roads like this cracking. You get foundations of buildings cracking. You get the lakes that had been there draining out because now they can go down into the soil. And those are areas that used to be habitat for waterfowl and for migrating animals as well, especially Alaska. Next slide. And lastly, we're warming the oceans, and we're also making them more acidic. That carbon dioxide gets absorbed by the ocean, and that increases acidity. It causes coral bleaching. It causes changes in kind of the fish, the ability of fish to survive in it. So, and then of course, for humans, affects the strength of hurricanes. Next slide. Okay, I want to leave this on a very a little bit more positive note, is that there are things that we can do about this. Next slide. There's two kind of areas, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is basically reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or reducing that that excess energy. Adaptation is saying, okay, well, we'll just deal with the changes. So mitigation is things like reducing carbon emissions, using renewable energy. It's also this emerging area of geoengineering. It's trying to figure out how to extract carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it safely back into the ground, or how to change the energy balance. For example, there's some that say, well, launch a bunch of little mirrors around the earth and reflect more of the sun's energy back. We don't know how that will affect weather patterns and things, so a lot more studies needed on either of those kinds of things, but it's an area that people are starting to look at. And then adaptation are basically that's actions taken to make us more resilient. So even if we stopped emitting carbon dioxide because of what we've already done, what's already in the atmosphere, we're going to see some more warming. We're going to see impacts related that's going to affect hazards and disasters. So we have to be ready for those. We have to consider that as we develop infrastructure, where we put things, how we build things. Sea level is going to rise, at least some measure. We have to consider about retreating from certain places or protecting critical facilities. And places that can't adapt are going to need international aid. That's one of the Department of Defense's biggest concerns, is instability caused by these climate change induced events, where you get major droughts, major storms that cause mass migration and destabilize political areas, and then can create civil wars and all sorts of things. So, so that international aid is essential to keep people in place and help them through it, rather than leading to that destabilization. Next slide. So this just some pictures, kinds of things we think of: mitigation, solar power, wind energy, electric buses, things like that. Next slide. And adaptation is things like green roofs in cities. In places, it's hard to have a green roof in Oklahoma. They don't survive the summer very well, we've learned. But in northern areas, there's places, I've seen these in Chicago, where you basically put plants on the roof, and that changes, instead of having a black surface that absorbs a lot of heat, you have a lighter colored surface which reflects some of that, and it helps cool the cities. And then determining the sizes of the culverts underneath the roads to handle increased floodwaters or increased intensity of storms going through there. So when we replace those culverts on the roads, just normal processes, put a bigger one in. And we have to figure out how big to make those. Next slide. And then I've got a few slides I'm just going to zip through here. These are individual actions, things that people can individually do to help combat climate change. Left them here as references if the slides will be available. Obviously, renewables energy and the decisions we make as what we're purchasing and what we're investing in things. Driving less, using public transportation if possible, carbon offsets if you have to travel. You can support a green project that will sequester carbon somewhere in a forest, for example. Next slide. Some more things you can do. I think our meat is actually very intensive because we're growing the plants and then we're feeding them to animals. So we're kind of getting double production there. Where you get your stuff, you're changing your shopping habits. If you buy locally, you have less transportation involved. Clothing manufacturing accounts for 3% of global carbon impacts. So if we can keep our clothes a little bit longer, then that'll help reduce some of the carbon dioxide. And then thinking not just about ourselves, but our families and habits and what they're doing, taking that into consideration. Next slide. And then this is just kind of ranking of some of those things. Just want to point out at the bottom of this, there's also civic actions, social actions, that being involved, raising awareness, being involved with candidates who are committed to addressing some of these challenges, and also just the inequalities that have to be addressed from disasters. Being involved in some of those things is very important and very effective because it goes beyond just you. So next slide. I think this is the last one I have, which is just some There's some links there that have these kinds of actions. So it may be something that you could involve in your classrooms, getting your kids thinking about what they could do and about climate change personally. And then also people notice what you do, your friends, family members, extended people, even your neighbors. If you put solar panels on your house, they may ask you about that, and you find that I'm saving money by doing this. It starts to multiply. So there's individual actions lead to community actions and actions among our friends. So that was all that I have, I believe. So we can take a couple of questions if anybody has them at this point.
Yeah, thank
Mark,
you
that
so
was
much.
so great. I actually do have a question unless somebody put one in the chat or anything. How much do you see local, like authorities, city managers, planners, politicians in general, do you see this like the adaptation and mitigation? Do you see, are they doing anything? Has it increased? I'm sure it's increased. Awareness has increased, but what are the larger planners doing? Has much changed in the last 10 or 20 years?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of good news there, especially on the adaptation side. I think the mitigation side, there's still a lot of resistance to doing that because it's very expensive, well, adaptation is expensive too, but it's when you do the mitigation, the benefits are diffuse. It's helping everybody around the world. When you do adaptation, it's helping your local community. So you're more likely to get investment in adaptation. We've had numerous discussions. A program I work with called SCIP, the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program. We've worked with planners and emergency managers on a lot of different kinds of things, hazard planning among it. And that's the kind of thing that that can just those conversations as they're looking towards what they're going to do in their cities, their infrastructure, their transportation plans, comprehensive plans, all those things, they're starting to think about climate change more. And this is from small cities to larger places. Oklahoma City, actually, which was very resistant to doing anything with climate change about 10 years ago, now is gotten a lot more interested in looking at anticipating what the impacts will be so they can start taking that into consideration as they upgrade their water systems, for example, and stormwater systems. So so the receptivity has increased. We actually had a colleague who did a study of messaging on climate change versus extreme weather events in Texas. He used a MTurk survey, which is a Amazon online survey that people can take. So random people involved. And he found a significant difference that when you use the phrase extreme weather events, they read a short statement, and when you had extreme weather events in there, it was statistically significantly more viewed more trustworthy as one that said climate change. Mm-hmm. So just the way you phrase it. So either way, the disasters are the delivery mechanism of climate change. That's what we see, these big events happening. We don't see the incremental increase in temperature day by day, really. It doesn't, it's kind of transparent. So it usually is kind of everything's about normal, and then all of a sudden something big happens. So I think people are starting to think, okay, well, what do I have to deal with? What am I going to have to deal with in the future? I think when you get to coastal areas, they already know this. They've known it for 20, 30, 40 years, that they've seen the sea levels coming up. They've seen these high tide events coming more frequently. They get that it's a real issue, and they're trying to address it. So there is action going on, and it's really using the levers that are out there, things like ongoing planning processes. When there is a disaster, using recovery funds in a way that considers building climate change impacts into, So you don't just put it back the way it was. You
Right.
build it better. And there's things that you can do to use some of those things to help out in there. I see a comment there from Susan about the animal crossings over interstates. I was just actually noticing there was a video making the rounds from, I think it's Colorado, where they've built a overpass, and they have a camera, wildlife camera on it, watching what's going. And they expected the deer and the moose, whatever, going across, bears, but then they also found like little rodents and things and all sorts of animals going across, and just really making use of it. So, and they try to make it blend in with the natural landscape. So those are really cool. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I see. Seeing difference in various regions of Oklahoma. Oh, that's a good question. As far as parts of Oklahoma, the Western Oklahoma, I guess both areas are seeing impacts, but they're different. Western Oklahoma is seeing a whole lot more drought than they used to. They're seeing more wildfires. The big thing with the wildfires is that we get these wet years like we had in 2015. So you get a lot of vegetation growing, and then it dries out. You get a drought on top of that. All that vegetation dries out, becomes fuel for these massive wildfires. So we've seen more of those kind of big wildfires in the last few years across Western Oklahoma. In Eastern Oklahoma, we're seeing a whole lot more of the flooding along the Arkansas River, this kind of stuck stationary system. When, there's some work suggesting the atmosphere gets stuck more like that, more than it used to, because it's warmer in the poles. It's the temperature difference isn't as strong, so things don't move as fast. And you get these weather patterns where it just brings rain, one storm after another, to an area. And we saw that along the Arkansas River last year in Tulsa, or in 2019 in Tulsa, around Tulsa and Muskogee in Eastern Oklahoma. So flooding is becoming more of a bigger issue, I think, in Eastern Oklahoma. So, so everybody gets a little something.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark, for that presentation. We do still have a few minutes, and we're going to go into our next speaker. Heather Braucher is here joining us today, and she's been an OKAGE teacher consultant for many, many years, and she's currently teaching at Justice Iowa Public Schools. And Heather, whenever you're ready, feel free to jump in and share whatever you would like.
Okay, awesome. That sounds great. Hello, everybody. Thanks for being with us today. Thank you, Dr. Shafer. You were just awesome. Love hearing from an expert. And then as, K-12 teachers, how do we take this to the classrooms for the kiddos? Especially 6-7, where we cover geography. I have a lesson that I have created about natural disasters. So let me share my screen really fast. Get that done. So here we go, share the screen. Okay, all right, can everybody see it? Okay, awesome. Okay, one thing that we can take to the kids when we look at the climate change, we look at natural hazards and disasters, and unfortunately some catastrophes. How does that affect developed versus developing countries? Low versus high socioeconomic status of various communities and individuals? What about how does that affect the local, regional, and overall whole global scale? One thing, some of our objectives are explain how the competition for scarce resources can cause economic and political conflict and cooperation. It's not like you have to just say, what is the impact of natural disasters? Explain the role of government policies in utilizing wealth from natural resources to finance development. What do we do after all of these natural disasters? What's the recovery? So that is one thing that I think geography can do in the classroom with the kids is we look at, change over time. We explain the present, but we also plan for the future, right? So I think one thing, a lesson that I have that the kids absolutely love. Can you see my screen still? We're good? Everything's good? Okay. One thing that the kids absolutely love is making like this disaster kit. It's so fun. The teacher next door to me has this right now. Okay, so I'm good. Everybody can see all this? Okay. The kids investigate natural disasters and discover the urgency to be prepared. Then they present to the class. So the kids actually make safety kits. They can just basically like a bag. I think the new term for it, which may have started for another reason besides safety, is like a bug out bag. But I think that may have been for, conspiracy theories. I'm just kidding, people. But, a bag if you have to evacuate and you have to leave. I'm just kidding. But students will identify the characteristics and distribution and demographic patterns of basically of natural disasters and things that happen to people in the Western Hemisphere, but also describe and analyze the role of geographic factors on current events and issues. We have all kinds of stuff to look at. Climate, natural disasters. Okay, so what do? You have to put it into action with kids, right? Okay, and then let me put this down. Okay, and then somebody stop me on time, okay, everybody? Students demonstrate the ability to access valid information. Health and literacy has all kinds of objectives for this. So with kids, I think one of the best things to do is put this information into action, best that we can. And I have seen over the years, sometimes ideas that kids come up with, you think they're crazy, or you think, wow, that's kind of out there. They are the future. And some of the things that I've heard, their ideas, their concepts they come up with, I've seen it happen later. Like people find a way to, have these things happen. So the main geographic theme is human environment interaction. Students basically are going to research facts on a natural disaster. They organize data and apply it to a prototype for explanation to peers. The kids love it. So we look at where the disasters are occurring, why. We've got, what's in urban and non-urban areas. Dr. Shafer kind of explained a lot of those things, and then I have it all on a kid level. So kids basically look at a disaster and end up making a kit. So also the other thing they look at is making an actual emergency plan with their families, what to do before, and even with the recovery a little bit, if they actually make a plan and have things prepared. I've had plenty of parents tell me, thank you so much for making this. We actually keep the kit in our car, or we have these bags, but we're going to add more things to it since you reminded us of some things. So it turns into a family thing. Okay, so, okay, I've got that. Okay, here we go. So I need to go to, let me get out of this and go to, this is what the kids do. They research and they bring the actual kits to the classroom. These days with virtual, kids can make one at home. If they're stuck at home, they can make something with basically kind of a online, this is what I would collect if I made one. I think making the real thing is better if possible. I've tried to be really relevant in this lesson with write down the top 3 things you should do to avoid this disaster, or if you're caught in it. And of course, sometimes they're funny, but really they have to think about it. Obviously, it's not go outside if there's a tornado, but some other things. So the kids make lists of what to put in it. I have all kinds of excellent sites with like ready.gov and things like that. So we actually have the disaster kits in another classroom right now. The kids just made them. I originally thought with the pandemic going on that the kids would not really want to do anything like that, or that they would feel apprehensive about talking about a disaster. They actually wanted the craziest ones, like, I want, the hurricanes and whatever. So they are actually doing fairly well with it. They aren't shying away like I thought. Of course, they're always sensitive when we talk about these things. So, and then the kids put this in their safety kit. So I have had kids bring these huge backpacks full of these total kits that their dads already had ready to go, or they would put it together. The dad already had items. I've had kids just take pictures around Walmart of things that if they could afford it, they would buy all these things. I thought that was the sweetest thing. This girl said, my mom's not going to do one thing, but we'll take pictures and print them. So I guess printing for, 20 cents, they would print pictures. So she just showed us her little photos, and that's the way it went. I prefer not to make it a slideshow because we need to be as real as possible, do as many things as we can to actually have kids feel that this is relevant, hands-on, and that's what teaching geography is all about. It's proposing solutions as we learn about the change over time and human environment interaction. So I know that was just a few minutes, but the other thing is that I also want to look at which countries are most likely to have trouble recovering from a natural disaster. So looking at more developed countries and less developed countries, we can put in all kinds of objectives that are within the 6th and 7th grade geography standards. And so this is a really neat thing, and kids can kind of take it on as their own. And it still is popular. So it's not necessarily something that's gone away with one of these lessons. And I think Becca and I have spoken, and one thing that she has brought up is, maybe putting more of a recovery role into it, not just, hey, let's make a little bag for what could possibly happen. What do we do for recovery? Because it's not just getting yourself ready for 2 days later. What are we doing as a whole community and getting ourselves ready for these disasters and afterwards? So, okay, that is just about everything in a few minutes. So, Becca, I will let you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather, for moving through that quickly. But yeah, to everyone in attendance, we'll have all of these materials available for download, so you'll be able to spend more time with them at your leisure. So does anyone have any questions really quick for Heather before we move on to the door prize drawing?
Ooh.
All right. So the door prize drawing for the 5 Nystrom desk atlases is for Stormy Howell. So Stormy, if you could just in the chat, if you want to just send me a private message with your mailing address, I can get those in the mail to you. So just let me know. You could also email me if that's easier. So that's my email. Well, great. Thank you so much to Mark and Heather for being here today. Everyone who participated is eligible to receive a PD certificate. So just email me at the email that I dropped in the chat with your first and last name to request one, and I'll send it to you. And after the session, you'll be able to download the lesson. I'll give you the link for that. All right. And our next session will be next month in January. We'll be doing the second Tuesday, as we always do, but the time will be 4:30 instead of 4. And that's because we're doing this with the Oklahoma Council for Social Studies conference. That session is going to be on the spread of democracy and authoritarianism around the world. And it will be led by Cody Sievertson, who's an OKAGE teacher consultant and National Geographic certified educator. So we hope you guys will be able to make it to that session. And if you have any suggestions for topics that you want us to cover within this series, let me give you a link so you can fill that out. Or you can always just send me an email if there's something that you would like for us to do. That's fine too. So I'll also send you all of our website, membership, and social media information in the chat. So that way you guys can have access to that if you guys haven't already followed us on social media. So that's all I have for you guys. Thank you again so much to Mark and Heather for being here, and thanks to Brenda for helping us with hosting this opportunity. And Brenda, do you have anything else that you want to go over before we say goodbye?
No, I would just say the OCSS conference is going to be there's going to be the 12th, then the 19th, and then whatever I'm not very good at math. Whatever the next Tuesday is at 4:30, and there's going to be 4 to 5 sessions each time. And because it's virtual, we're going to be able to have national presenters that we would have never been able to afford them to fly here to do this. So the NCSS president, Stephanie Wager from Iowa, will be doing a session on media literacy. Joe Schmidt, who is me in Maine, is going to be doing 2 sessions, one about controversial topics. How do you teach those with your students? And one about assessing social studies. So I think those are going to be really great. We're also going to have Nate from Harvard University, who's doing argument mapping. It's a way for kids to structure their arguments for that claim and evidence and reasoning part. And so we're really excited with a lot of other people also coming, but I know those are some people who are coming. And then plus we have all of our organizations, OKAGE, the Economic Council, the Oklahoma History Center, they're also going to be doing. So spread it to other teachers that you know. I think it's going to be great. It's free. And those links will be coming out soon, so you'll be able to pick which Zoom you want to go to. And then like every conference, you know that you want to go to all 5 of them during that session. So they're going to be recorded and posted so you can view them later so that you can see all of them. So in a silver lining of not having an in-person conference, we're getting to have really great people we might not have had, and we get to record them. So we're doing the best we can with that, but it's a really great opportunity for all social studies teachers, and there'll be geography pieces in there also.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. Looking forward to it.
And we appreciate you spending your December evening with us. We understand how busy you are at this time of the year, and virtual and non-virtual, and trying to get it all together. And Susan in Alaska
Especially
with
a
our
nice
time
day.
change. So we appreciate, and I don't know if Catherine is still on, but Catherine Boomer, if you don't know, Catherine is our social studies and ELA assessment person, and she's been gracious enough to try to join as many social studies things as she can. So when you see Catherine show up, she's our assessment person at the State Department, and we're really lucky to have her with us. Thanks again. And if you don't have any other questions for Mark or Heather or Becca, we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.